I'll formally introduce Ian. Ian, as Chris has just told us, is a very independent thinker. He's a former environmental scientist with interest in technical, ethical and theological aspects of mineral resources and nuclear power. Ian has authored several books on mining, on the environment and economic issues, and also on nuclear energy. Although Ian is retired, he is a senior advisor at the World Nuclear Association, and Ian is also a fellow of ISCAST. So Ian will be talking tonight on truth and vested interests and the use and abuse of science. And I hope you all enjoy Ian's talk, which I'm sure you will. So welcome, Ian.
Thanks, Sarah. Well, let's get going. So first of all, there are a number of important issues which have a basis in science, but where that's been misrepresented in public discourse so that it's driven by fear and or populism. Some people develop what's been called emotional antibodies to scientific acceptance or progress, and we can instance anti-vax movement, ionising radiation, GMOs, and even young Earth creationism. Scientific knowledge is often less than needed for application. Whoops, why was that moving? The needed for application to public policies. So how do we manage that? And I want to raise 4 issues which have different characteristics: the Great Barrier Reef, climate change, COVID-19, and nuclear power, or one aspect of that. In all 4, the science tends to be infected or overlaid by politics. Fear is paramount when there's uncertainty, and I think fear readily overrides rationality. And I think some of the COVID reactions, particularly by the Victorian government, has illustrated that. Last week, Michael Clarke said that young people were rightly concerned about the future of the planet, and we should listen to them. I agree. But if their concern morphs to fear, then we need to ask how well-based those fears are. The actual science is relevant. Addressing popular concerns needs to draw upon wisdom and experience as well as science. Solutions need to actually work and have regard to opportunity costs. Discourse needs to avoid just mocking extreme positions, such as we heard last week. It needs to grapple with moral dilemmas which usually arise. Freeman Dyson, a polymath physicist, astrophysicist, I think has made some very good points here, which I think can be put up in lights for ISCAST. Science can only progress by constant argument and contrarianism. Subversive scientists who constantly challenge the conventional wisdom are essential and should not be hounded out of the system. He documents early medical consensus regarding bleeding as therapy. We see a community of people happily united in a false belief. Anyone who questioned the prevailing belief would upset the peace of the community. And as humans, we evolved to feel at home in a group that thinks alike. It was more important for a group to be united than to be right. When authority was seriously threatened, heretics were burned at the stake. So let's start with the Great Barrier Reef and Peter Redd. Peter Redd has worked on the Great Barrier Reef since 1984 at the Australian Institute of Marine Science and at James Cook Uni. His research has appeared in over 100 publications in international journals, mostly relating to the Great Barrier Reef and marine applications. He points out that the reef comprises about 3,000 coral reefs, covering an area the size of Victoria. Most reefs are far offshore. He was sacked from his position as Professor of Physics at James Cook University in 2018 after publicly criticising the academic findings of his colleagues. He said that the Australian Institute of Marine Science and JCU were producing results that were untrustworthy due to insufficient quality assurance protocols. Peer review is often a bit too cosy. In particular, he pointed to the fact that detailed surveys of coral were carried out by AIMS, but the data for the last 15 years remained unavailable. JCU has never attempted to disprove claims made by Dr. Reid about the Great Barrier Reef. And this particular chart, I think, is showing where the problem is. This is sort of 1900 to 2020. This is the data from the published by AIMS, and this is Reid's prediction. He would say that this was either an anomaly of measurement or simply an annual sort of coral bleaching. So that's his prediction for 2020, and that's AIMS' prediction for 2020, about a 30% decrease in coral health, coral growth rate, basically. So Reid raises questions of transparency, honesty, and truth, and whether scientific consensus is always healthy or can even be an oxymoron. Reid said that the peer review system on its own is deficient in many ways, not least being that it almost always guarantees groupthink and can often exclude views from dissenting scientists. Dissent, skepticism, replication, testing, and checking were essential to science, but didn't happen anywhere near as much as they should, he said. And it's interesting to note that by crowdfunding, he's raised nearly the full $730,000 target for a High Court appeal to his dismissal, and that is proceeding. So let's get on to something more complicated. Peter Reid and the Great Barrier Reef is relatively simple. It's purely a scientific issue. There are some policy things that hang off it, but I haven't touched on those. The climate change and global warming is much more complex. Beyond the very basic science, there are many uncertainties, and these have been glossed over in advocacy and in public discourse. The nature of science has been misrepresented egregiously. Populism is driving policy unreasonably. A sense of urgency, as distinct from importance, is unwarranted and counterproductive. Our national policies must, I suggest, be balanced with other domestic priorities, achieve what is wanted, and relate to international priorities and sustainable development goals. So what is the science regarding climate change? Note that it's not experimental in a laboratory, nor is it forensic like much geology, but it involves measurement. It involves attributing cause to observed change. It involves modelling future change. And of course, any modelling has a lot of inputs, which are maybe fairly subjectively judged, and then judging the effects of all this. So as you go down that list of four, there's increasing uncertainty, quite obviously. Just looking at an fairly old diagram of the globe and carbon cycle, you notice some of these big figures around as to what's coming and going in red. Burning fossil fuels over here, the updated figure is about 10 gigatons per year. So it's a relatively small part of the overall carbon cycle, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. So climate change is an area where popular sentiment, in this case fear of possible future effects, have stretched the scientific narrative into the realms of danger and crisis. So no amount of effort or public funding is too much in endeavouring to counter the looming apocalypse in the views of some. The scientific evidence shows a clear and inexorable rise in atmospheric CO2, which evidently has some effect on climate, but how much it drives change is uncertain. Even less certain are the consequences of incremental global warming. Reputable scientists critiquing the mainstream narrative should be answered, not excommunicated. Prudence, and by reputable scientists, I mean people who know something about atmospheric science. I don't mean people sort of in some other area altogether. Prudence demands curbing CO2 emissions, but the importance and urgency of this is contested. So the conduct of science is what's in question in the same sort of way experienced by Peter Reid. Simply invoking science does not justify any belief, no matter how deeply or sincerely held. So-called scientific consensus is played off against those who are skeptical of some interpretations and conclusions, though all good science ought to be fundamentally skeptical. And extravagant but largely ineffective energy policies have popular support. Now, the basis of the science is the IPCC, and the scientific, and they publish actual scientific reports. And you need to distinguish those from the summaries for policymakers, which have some, shall we say, fairly heavy interpretation sometimes. IPCC is one of the finest pieces of academic collaborative research ever, according to a friend of Alan Gisber's, and I'd agree with that. But the IPCC was set up to examine only human-induced climate change, which rather begs the question scientifically. Why not the extent and causes of climate change? At any rate, the IPCC is good, and its science is good and should be taken seriously. And you've all seen graphs like this, I'm sure. This is CO2 from 1960 to 2020. This is global surface temperature over the same period. How much of a connection, I'll leave it to the climate scientists to assert. This is a CSIRO chart, and I've just put in an arrow there to show you just 1960, so that to the right of that is the same time scale as the other. And that's global greening, according to Havard et al. And this is leaf level physiological changes stimulated by carbon dioxide. Now, incidentally, that's 3 times what the IPCC assessment report 5 forecast. So it does rather differ from IPCC. But beyond science.
Ian, could I stop you there for a minute? I might be a bit slow, but could you just tease out that graph a little bit more for us?
Sure.
Just for me. I'm sure everybody else picked it up instantly, but just for me.
No, well, I don't go to the source of it, but it's related to physiological changes directly stimulated by carbon dioxide is the dark green, sort of leaf level. The overall increase in leaf matter is light green, and the effects of climate change are added to that. That's which I'm not quite sure how that adds to the actual greening. So I can't expound it further than that, I'm afraid, Chris, at this point. But it's just to sort of show that there is a reputable source that's saying there are some good things or some green things happening as a result. But the IPCC was set up by the World Health Organization and the World Meteorological Organization. And the Secretary General of the latter said last year that climate change is not going to be the end of the world. The world is just becoming more challenging. In parts of the globe, living conditions are becoming worse, but people have survived in harsh conditions. And he said that alarmists have, in effect, been cherry picking from the IPCC reports. So this, again, raises the question, is scientific consensus actually an oxymoron? Now, here are a whole lot of things about what climate skeptics and climate crisis. I'll skip that. That's really just sort of definitional. But coming to some basics, climate change is an extreme example of science that is variously hyped and denied, making it difficult for non-experts to tell the difference. Organizations like the IPCC are absolutely essential to the integrity of science as viewed by politicians and the public. Playing things straight in the media can sustain public and policymaker trust in the scientific community. And one might say, if only, or we would wish. But then again, look at the load that's on journalists these days, and there aren't too many specialists. The effects of climate change have not yet been detected in Australian fires, but changes underway suggest that those effects will be detectable as early as the 2040s. If so, we should expect more and more more and more intensifiers and respond accordingly. And that's, I think, a fair statement. So there's broad agreement in climate change that the main radiative gas, CO2, is increasing in the atmosphere, as we saw on the earlier graph, beyond 410 ppm to about 50% more than the pre-industrial level. That's quite a lot. And burning fossil fuels is a significant contributor. Some warming is happening, and more than half of this is extremely likely to be anthropogenic, according to the IPCC. And that 2013 Assessment Report 5 is the latest science assessment report. It's virtually certain that there will be more frequent hot and fewer cold temperature extremes over most land areas on a daily and seasonal timescales, and it's very likely that heat waves will occur with a higher frequency and duration, but occasional cold winter extremes will continue. There's no clear evidence of other weather extremes, hurricanes, droughts, etc. So what are the scientific uncertainties or disagreements on climate change? The saturation effect of CO2 in the 12.5 to 18 micrometer infrared band is one. Climate sensitivity estimates is another, and they've reduced. Occasional that is the sensitivity of climate to the temperature change and the CO2 change. Occasional non-anthropogenic sources of CO2, fires, volcanoes. CO2 sinks, it's fairly long-lived, and there's some uncertainty about the quantum of sinks and how much they might change with increased atmospheric concentration. Climatic versus non-climatic effects of CO2, and I should put up the graph about vegetation growth, for instance. The role of methane, which is now 2.5 times pre-industrial level, but it's short-lived, but very powerful as a greenhouse gas. I don't know why this keeps changing. Hydrofluorocarbons, solar variation heading down from 2020, which may have some effect according to some, sea level change. And if temperature increases, say 2 degrees Celsius, is that necessarily bad? And if so, how bad and for whom? Keep in mind that climate skeptics as different as Lindzen, Lomborg, Pielke, Lawson hold positions that overlap largely with the generally agreed view. They're not sort of out at some extremity. They have most of what they are on about overlaps very well. Temperature increase due to greenhouse gases may be problematic in places or regions, may be beneficial elsewhere. Of course, we can and should act to improve air quality, and that's beyond CO2, of course. Climate denial, I suggest, is largely a propaganda myth invented by the consensus enforcers. We shall not be able to establish objectively who is right anytime soon because of the timescale involved. And in any case, the dream of zero carbon and a peaceful reversion to a world without concrete and steel is an absurd fantasy. So there has been this IPCC report in 2018, which has supplemented the assessment report of the scientists, which I've been quoting earlier. I won't spend time on this, but it's there if you want to come to it later. And then there's been a 2019 report on the ocean and cryosphere, which has also had some useful things to say, but just perhaps adding more confidence to what was said earlier. Arctic sea ice in extent. We hear a lot about Arctic sea ice and the extent to which it's disappearing, but this doesn't suggest so. There are 4 IPCC scenarios, but look, I'm not going to spend time on those. So let's just, and nor will I spend time on the contrary or qualifying evidence and opinion, but these names you will see occasionally: Lindzen, Spencer, Curry, Pielke, Senior and Junior. Ian Plimer, of course, is a geologist, and he makes some good points, but I think his causal link with current things is a non sequitur. So we have this language of crisis, emergency, danger, etc. And a global network of 500 scientists and professionals published something about a year ago. There is no climate emergency. And they suggested that climate science should be less political, while climate policies should be more scientific. Scientists should openly address the uncertainties and exaggerations in their predictions, while politicians should dispassionately count the real benefits as well as the imagined costs of adaptation to global warming. So, but I have to say that the 6 supporting points have been much critiqued, but those 3 major points seem to me very sensible. And you've got discredited alarmists who provoke those who are sceptical of the need for any action. If these people shut up, I think there wouldn't be such a strong reaction. Al Gore in 2006, we may have only 10 years to save the planet from turning into a total frying pan. Tim Flannery, the collapse of civilization due to climate change becomes inevitable with business as usual. Was his predictions haven't been very well attributed, and then haven't been very well panned out. David Attenborough, again, Southeast Australia is on fire. Why? Because temperatures of the Earth are increasing, following some documentaries which have been much criticised of his. So out of all this, you get 2 opposite baleful effects. Pushback from within the scientific community, which garners wider, e.g. political support, and scepticism regarding any costly action. And in the other direction, you've got popular credulity and concern, even alarm, leading to political pressure and a sense of urgency driven by fear. The outcome is then polarisation at popular and political levels. And we've seen that in the Labor Party this week, federally, while science is left out of it and becomes irrelevant. And I'd say that in the political sphere, science is largely irrelevant at this point. The whole thing's got momentum quite apart from science in both directions. Except that the alarmism attracts funding, so it's intrinsically biased to self-perpetuate and to censor or cancel critics who raise doubts. And Don Aitken, former Vice-Chancellor of Canterbury Uni, makes the very pertinent point. Sorry about this. Since the academies exist in part to attract money to science, it makes no sense for them to do otherwise than support the orthodoxy. And then, of course, the vested interests of particular policies drive them apart from any science. So just concluding this little section, or major section, nothing Australia can do will make any difference to world or local climate this century. And that was said by Chief Scientist Alan Finkel. It's much quoted, and I don't see any reason to disagree with it. In fact, I don't know of anybody who does disagree with it, although they obviously feel it's counterproductive in tone. Also, the Southern Hemisphere is a net sink for CO2 already. That's an important point to note in terms of Australia policies. So, should we do nothing or little or nothing to limit or reduce CO2 emissions? Or should we take action in line with the UN Federal Framework Convention on Climate Change commitments, COP talkfests, Paris Agreement, etc., and consonant with the best efforts of any other country? Or should we do heroically more than UNFCCC commitments? And ethics, economics, and politics come into play just for our domestic situation. And then what about coal and LNG exports with emissions attributed elsewhere? They're outside the FCCC commitments. They don't have any bearing on Australia's figures or figures attributed to Australia, but they contribute CO2 to the atmosphere when they're burned or used for steel making, wherever that is. Australia has an obligation to make its resources available to less well-endowed countries, in line with UN Sustainable Development Goals via trade. Our coal and LNG exports are vital to economies in India, China, South Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia. We also export uranium, which avoids about 250 million tonnes of CO2 per year emissions overseas. Should we contra that? So, ethics, economics, politics again come into play as we balance those 4 facts. And then there are geopolitical implications as well. So, is this a nightmare or something better? So, coming on to something a bit more simple in some ways, COVID-19. And this was yesterday's Australian editorial. The power of science is set to conquer COVID pandemic. Right now, the world is in the throes of a viral pandemic. The virus is nasty, very easily transmitted, but not unduly virulent. That's to say, very low fatality rate from it. Some measures are clearly necessary to counter its transmission, guided by both science and assessment of human behaviour. So, is a heavy lockdown actually effective in the short term? How does COVID epidemiology balance with other health priorities? And here you can sort of contrast Sutton versus the Great Barrington Declaration, completely different, completely going differently. What will be the long term, and the Barrington Declaration is backed up by some pretty, heavy world-class epidemiologists and scientists. What will be the long-term epidemiological outcomes of quite different strategies exemplified by New Zealand and Taiwan or Sweden at the extremes? We shall have to wait and see. But the heavy policies by nervous governments transcending democratic norms are allowed and encouraged by public fear, regardless of collateral consequences. Is the response proportional, let alone sensible? Governments can and do justify anything by claiming that it is, quote unquote, to save lives, as we keep hearing from Mr. Andrews, implicitly claiming a scientific basis where there may be none, and with a very narrow focus, that is to say, focus on the virus rather than other health effects related to lockdowns. And finally, get on to something closer to my last 25 years experience, nuclear power, and in particular ionising radiation. The atomic age, initiated in public consciousness by the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs in 1945, has given rise to proper fear of ionising radiation, something humans have all experienced at a low level since the dawn of time. From the 1950s, a lot of scientific work has sought to quantify the hazard of this, and a body of work which is now known to be fraudulent has underpinned what is known as the linear no threshold hypothesis, LNT. This extrapolates back to zero the known effects of high levels of exposure, and thereby suggests that any level of exposure must have some ill effects. This refuted theory remains the basis of international radiation protection rules. And international radiation protection bodies will say that this is supposedly conservative. But at Fukushima, we had a huge nuclear accident which killed no one, but the government had killed, the Japanese government killed over 2,000 people by applying it, in terms of not just evacuation, but maintaining that evacuation for more than a couple of weeks for years. And those are government figures, incidentally, not put up by anybody else. However, LNT ignores the evidence of hormesis, the adaptive biological response to a challenge. Virtually every known toxin or substance which is harmful at some levels is beneficial or innocuous at very low levels. It's now clear that ionising radiation effects are hormetic, and at low levels, radiation confers benefits. These benefits may be direct, stimulating cell repair, or in conditioning the human system to be less affected by higher levels, which would otherwise be harmful in some degree. The wide result of taking the LNT hypothesis as scientifically sound is that vast amounts of money have been spent on reducing public and occupational exposure levels as low as possible, along with generating a narrative of fear and radiophobia. This in turn has limited the use and human benefit of technologies that involve ionising radiation, notably nuclear power. Thankfully, not so much nuclear medicine. At a time when prudent limitation of CO2 emissions is seen to be necessary, this is a major influence on energy policy. It both over-regulates nuclear technologies expensively, as well as allowing and promoting huge expenditure on technology, which is increasingly problematical as its use expands, and which on the whole is ineffective. And I'm thinking of particularly wind and solar, vast investments there. Australia has the unique absurdity of making nuclear power illegal, though we supply a lot of the world's fuel for it. The nuclear overregulation, along with many other aspects of life today, for instance, car airbags due to many Americans' refusal to wear seatbelts, and traffic control around roadworks, which seems to assume zero common sense by motorists, lead to consideration of what is reasonable in minimising risks of all kinds on the basis of science, and whether society has an implicit presupposition of biological immortality, so that any state prevails. But that's beyond science, so let's go skydiving or bungee jumping. So in conclusion, I suggest Christians should care about God's creation, and they should care about the integrity of science, and they should care about public policies relevant to both. And I declare my vested interest in urgent action to replace CO2 emitting electricity generation. But I'm more passionate about the integrity of science and its application. So thanks for your attention.
Well, there we go. Now, I don't think anybody here has not been provoked to think one way or another by Ian's talk tonight. Ian, you might like to stop sharing your screen if you don't want us to know what you've got on your computer.
Oh, sorry, I thought I had.
Yeah, no worries.
Stop share, right. Got it.
Thanks, Ian. So let's get into a discussion. I have about 8 points that I would like to ask Ian, but I'll hold back a bit. Sarah sent me a message to say that children are demanding her time, so I'll chair our time together now. Mark, I haven't read your question, but I see you've got a question, so why don't you just turn on your audio and ask your question.
Hello, Ian. Thank you very much. I've known about LNT and the stuff around for quite some time now. Just as an interested member of the public, I tend to follow science things. It seems to me that it's all part of the problem of power. Power within its wider Christian context is about using and exercising authority for the good of people. But the way it rolls out in certainly contemporary society is that power is something to be grasped. Jesus Christ didn't, but people do grasp power. So when LNT takes hold, all the systems are set up, and then the bottom falls out, people are very reluctant to give up on it. I know that the French have, but they always do their own thing anyhow, but just about no other country is looking at changing it. Is it about power? I mean, is it just about sin?
There's a difference. Look, I don't know. I think it's just become very, very embedded in ICRP, and you still get people talking about being conservative, and you can't do any damage by having no radiation rather than low levels of it, etc. But I think what this overlooks is just the sheer costs of the whole thing. But no, I wouldn't sort of say that ICRP are on a power trip.
Sorry, Ian, what's ICRP? International
Commission for Radiological Protection, sorry. I meant to, they're the sort of world body that looks at these, or one world body that looks at them. On the other hand, if you read stuff from UNSCEAR, which is the UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, which is a bit more specific, that's a very eminent body, and I think you can see a fair bit of skepticism coming in, because they're actually documenting effects rather than sort of what purports to be basic science. But look, I can't comment on the motivations. I'm sorry, Mark. Beyond that.
Feel free to chip in. You don't have to use the chat if you want to wave your hand. Can I encourage everybody who's got a camera to put themselves on camera? It just makes it a bit more congenial if we can see faces. Of course, you don't have to, but if you can be encouraged to do so. We've got a question from Charles there. So Charles, why don't you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thanks, Ian. I too am very interested in the politics, the power plays and so on. Do you think we're now seeing the climate change lobby getting a lot of power and then trying to silence their opposition, the so-called climate deniers? What sort of things can we do there to, as you said, not silence the dissenting voices who need to be heard and their actual ideas dealt with, rather than just simply shutting them up? Thanks.
Well, yes, I think that you're right, that there is a push there. And what can we do? I think just by keep pointing to the science and keep asking questions. Particularly questions about, okay, well, the increase in CO2 is clear. The increase in temperature isn't always so clear, but just keep pushing the question of so what, and on what basis is that so what answered?
Okay then. Particularly with regard to the Great Barrier Reef, that climate change is supposed to be endangering it, making the water too hot. Wouldn't the climate, global warming, mean that only the northern end of the reef would perhaps die out as that water becomes too hot? But at the southern end of the reef, or beyond the southern end of the reef, where at present the water's too cold for coral, that'll warm up, coral will grow there, and eventually the Great Barrier Reef would effectively, not actually, but effectively move south, so that our barrier reef tours might be based in Brisbane or Sydney or Hobart in the future.
Interesting thought. I don't know. I'm not sufficiently up with the science in terms of what temperatures corals need and don't need. But my impression is that different corals can tolerate a fair bit of warmth. Which is why we tend to get them in northern latitudes rather than southern ones. But that's not my area, and I've not read up on it.
Thanks,
Okay,
Ian.
thank you.
If nobody's waving their hand, I'll ask a question. It strikes me, this is a little bit of a comment and then a question. The question, of course, will be, do you agree? It strikes me that there are people on both extremes, call them talking about the climate change issue, but any one of these issues, deniers on one extreme who know what the answer is and just can't get everybody to see it. The catastrophists at the other extreme who are absolutely confident they know what's going on, but can't get everybody to see the obvious solutions as they see them. And then in the middle, there are people who try to take the science seriously and recognize the unknowns. And the people in the middle are left with the problem of managing the unknowns. And then doesn't it just become, or a large part of it, doesn't it become an attitude to risk thing? Because I can imagine that many people who are here tonight, we might eventually be able to come to an agreement on what the science is saying, what the unknowns are. But then if we all talk about what we ought to do about it, some of us will say, with a sort of confident optimism in technology and our abilities over the next decades to deal with things, some of us will say, we don't have to take very dramatic steps. Others will say, well, given the risk involved, we ought to be taking dramatic steps now. And those two groups of people who are disagreeing with each other are not disagreeing about the science. It's actually that they've got different attitudes to risk. They're weighing up the risks and the possible benefits and disbenefits, and they're weighing them up differently. That's my comment. Now my question, Ian, what do you think?
I think we should be taking action, but I think it needs to be effective action. You know, and we've got to find way, you know, I think we should be finding ways to reduce CO2 emissions. But I don't think that's urgent. I mean, it's urgent to find ways. I don't think it's necessarily urgent to implement them. Because as the chief scientist has said, you know, nothing we do is going to make any difference this century. And to shoot ourselves in the foot while countries such as India and China are massively increasing their CO2 emissions doesn't seem to be very smart. So yes, we should do something, and yes, we should keep up with most of our trading countries. Again, China and India and a few others would be exceptions. But let's do what works and do it in a cost-effective way.
Okay, let me, before we get to James' question, let me ask my question again, because I was actually asking another question. So you've given one answer to what do you think, but I think the more important, well, I think the question about why we have this disagreement is it because we have different attitudes to risk? Is that what the fundamental disagreement is about? Not actually about the science so much as how we weigh up the precautionary principle and different attitudes to risk.
Yes.
My hunch is that that's what's going on. And you mentioned a few things in your talk, particularly about politicians' tendency to not take risks. And I think perhaps what we've seen in Victoria has been driven by an attitude to risk and unwillingness to take risk. But I've done enough talking. I'd like to hear what other people have to say. James, I have noticed your question. Okay, it's not a comment. Please read James's comment in the chat. And Rob and Jenny, would you like to make a comment? Because I see you've made a comment in the chat. And then we'll get back to Graham McLean as well.
We might be catastrophists, but let's say we're only 5% right. The future is disastrous if that 5% is correct.
Okay, so is that a comment about your attitude to risk, that if and therefore you think we ought to take dramatic action now because the way you weigh the risk, even if it's only a small risk, it's such a significant one that we ought to take dramatic action now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly. And Australia is the biggest per capita emitter of CO2 when exports are taken into account.
Yep.
In the developed world.
Roger, I don't know if you've got a microphone tonight, but did you want to make a comment, or shall we just read it? Roger hasn't had a microphone in past weeks. I suspect he doesn't have one tonight, so you're welcome to read his comment in the chat there. Okay, why don't we go back to Graham McLean's question about Finkel's remark? Graham, over to you.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Ian. Ian, you've a couple of times appealed to the chief scientist's remark, and on this last occasion as a reason for not taking urgent action now on climate change. Now, I didn't hear the remark, and I haven't seen the context of the remark, so you'll have to correct me if I'm misinterpreting why he says what he says. But I would assume that he's saying that any action Australia takes will be so small in relation to needed action to make a difference that it won't make a difference this century. That may be perfectly true, but obviously every country could take a similar position and say, well, nothing we do will make a difference. But if every country does take that position and nobody makes a difference, the required difference won't happen. So the fact that one individual's contribution won't make the difference is not a reason for the individual not making taking that action, because we're all required to do our little bit. That's just the rational requirement. Now, have I misinterpreted Finkel's remark? And if I haven't, don't you agree that his remark cannot be taken as a recipe for thinking that we don't need to take urgent action?
Correct. That's right. It should not be taken that way. And I summarised the 3 points in my concluding slide on climate change. You did have 3 options: do nothing, keep up with other countries, and proceed reasonably firmly and deliberately towards with policies which will reduce CO2 emissions, or we could dramatically go mad and do everything that's conceivable, and way beyond what other countries are doing. And I'd come down with that middle position, definitely. Get on with it, but don't kid ourselves that it's going to change anything in our lifetimes, or our children's or our grandchildren's lifetimes.
Can I just follow that up? So does get on with it, if the whole world gets on with it, would you agree that changes could be made by, say, 2050?
Oh, look, I think that the more countries that do get on with it and do make changes, the better. Yes, undoubtedly. I mean, that's plain. Yeah. And the more countries that get on board with that kind of policy, the more effect it will have. Certainly.
Yeah. So again, to just follow that up, if you were advising government, would you say that we ought to be part of a global network that's sharing the responsibility in that way, trying to do our bit, balancing other considerations as well, but do our bit for global action with that sort of aim in mind?
Yes, we should keep up with the best practice internationally in addressing the situation, and use the options that we have or should have. The moment where the main option in relation to electricity generation for a country like Australia is off the table, which is totally bizarre, and no federal government has had the spine to do anything about that.
And what would that option be, Ian?
Nuclear power.
Nuclear power. Yeah.
And
well, if I may say, Ian, you know perfectly well I'm no scientist at all, but I've had a number of very senior nuclear scientist friends I've been in touch with who have said, until Fukushima, they said there really is no question that the most rational way of dealing with our future energy needs, given challenges of climate change and so on, is nuclear power. But Fukushima has made a difference to that political state of affairs, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think it has politically, but it hasn't in terms of any of the numbers with regard to safety. I mean, if you can have an accident, you got a tsunami which killed 19,000 people, which precipitated a nuclear accident, because if the plant had been built 5 meters further up the hill, you would never have heard of it. It precipitated a nuclear accident which killed nobody. For goodness sake, if that isn't safety, Rolls-Royce safety, what is? So that's remarkable. But the point is, I think that you need to look at Germany. I mean, Germany has a policy of phasing out nuclear power, and yet they claim to be doing stuff for the environment and global warming. So what this policy has effectively done is to give them an enormous dependence on solar and wind. It has not altered their CO2 emission to any significant degree at all. And they absolutely depend on energy flows, electricity flows across their borders. And they have a little bit more hydro potential than we have. But the point is, if Australia tried to do anything like that and get along without nuclear power, and they've still got a lot of nuclear power, by the way, if we tried that, we'd be hopeless, because we cannot import and export electricity in the same way as they can. and if we had their sort of 24%, I think they're up to, independence on solar and wind, we'd be absolutely cactus when the wind wasn't blowing for any prolonged period of time. So, you know, we couldn't possibly match them. And this has all been modelled quite well. But in Germany, so the effect with Germany has been that they've doubled their price of electricity. They're subsidising wind and solar to the tune of about 25 billion euros per year. They've got a very precarious situation, which is totally supported by their neighbours. France, which is 75% nuclear. Poland, which, and anyway, they've got countries all around us, you know, and some have got good hydro resources. But Australia is just not in a position to increase our hydro beyond our present 5% to any significant degree at all. So where do we go if we want to reduce our CO2? Building more wind turbines and solar is just totally hopeless.
Why is that, Ian?
Well, because when the sun's not shining right now, I don't think you'd be getting much solar power off your roof. I'm not. And you get a prolonged period of no wind, you've got no electricity. And one of the main things about electricity is that it needs to be reliable as well as affordable. And, you know, look, I can send anybody a paper on this. You know, it comes down to the system cost. I mean, people talk about the cost of wind and solar coming down. That is true at the point of generation. That's the levelized cost of electricity, LCOE. Those costs are relatively low and decreasing in wind and solar, which is great. But the point is, as the proportion of those in the mix increases beyond about 10%, I think in Australia it's now 12% of wind and solar, then your system costs increase. And by the time you get up to where Labor's policy was pointing, which were 50% renewables by 2030 or 2040 or sometime, by the time you get up to 50% renewables, which means 45% wind and solar, the system costs at least equal the generation costs. So you double your price of electricity, and you still haven't got a reliable system.
Let me encourage everybody to read the chat. If you haven't got the chat visible, you can find the chat by going down probably to the bottom of your screen and clicking the button on chat. And then a window will pop up because people are making comments in the chat that are worth reading too. Steve, did you want to speak up about that comment that you made, the question you asked too?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Ian, I've enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much. I am a little concerned about the increasing polarisation at both ends of the spectrum. And I'm just wanting to see a comment from you as to whether that's in any way driven, do you think, by the academics needing to be noticed in order to, I think the expression they use is, excuse me, publish or perish. Somebody has to be prepared to hear what they have to say. And also they want to get funding from various people, whether it's right-wing think tanks or left-wing think tanks or right-wing governments or left-wing governments in order to do their research. Does that lead to extremism, do you think, to over-egging the conclusions that's drawn from research itself, which doesn't seem to be that controversial between the two ends?
Yeah, I think it does a bit. I point to Don Aitken's comment that I had on the screen. He was referring to the, you know, things like the Academy of Science and so forth, even the Academy of Technological Sciences for that matter. But I think the same applies just to academics generally. Yes.
Why don't we move on to move backwards to the Peter Ridd case? I've got a question, and then Peter Fagg's got a question. Firstly, Ian, I wonder if you could just clarify: was Peter Ridd sacked? I mean, I know the answer to this question, I think, but was Peter Ridd sacked on the basis of science, or if not, why was he sacked?
He was sacked for criticising his colleagues, and that was seen to be not very collegial. And his science has not been contested, but he I don't know the man. I've only spoken with him once. He may have been fairly heavy-handed in his criticism. I don't know, but it was on the basis of not being very collegial.
So he broke the agreement with his employer or something like that.
His employer thought that he had contravened, being nice to colleagues sort of statement. Yep.
Okay, over to you, Peter Fagg.
Unmute.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Look, I think Ian has, my question is, are there any other scientists that agree with Peter Ridd, or is he way out on a limb scientifically? I mean, partly you answered that question, but I mean, it's an extreme situation when a scientist gets sacked from a university. Has he got any other scientists that back him up, or?
I believe so, but I can't name them.
Right.
And the fact that his science has not been contested, I think, is the important point.
Do you think his science is correct?
I'm no judge of marine science. I see no reason. I see no reason to doubt it, and the reason I say that is because he's pointed to anomalies which I can understand in the AIMS approach, particularly withholding the last 15 years of data from quite an expensive scientific program. But also he has endured an inquiry which was brought in Queensland due to his criticism of AIMS, and he came out of that looking very clean, because he pointed out that AIMS had really based some conclusions on some very anomalous inshore reefs. There are 2 or 3 reefs in the Great Barrier Reef system which are close inshore and which have had some effect from agricultural runoff. But the 95% plus of the Great Barrier Reef is well offshore, and that has not been affected by any agriculture or anything else. And that was the contention from the Queensland inquiry, which I have some details of somewhere, but not in my front of my head. He came out looking very good from that. That's partly what's given him confidence to go to appeal his dismissal, which was upheld by one court, but he's now going to the High Court. And the High Court has apparently looked at it, and while they knock back most things that are pushed at them, they've accepted this.
Thanks, Ian.
Okay, why don't we ask James to ask his question first, and then Mark can follow it up as he sees fit once he's heard Ian's answer to James's question. So over to you, James. I'm just looking for James. I can't hear you, James. Are you muted, or have you? There you are. Go ahead.
Right. Okay.
Yep.
Though no one died directly from radiation from the Fukushima, probably the people who were trying to manage the failure of the reactor didn't actually have any great health benefits from the radiation. I was wondering whether there was any work done on the ecological impact of the outfall of the Fukushima disaster.
I think there has been, James, but I don't know anything really in detail about it. I was fairly full bottle on Fukushima for about a couple of years after the accident, but I've let it fade off my radar since then, I'm afraid.
Thanks.
And Mark. Mark Duffett, are you there? You're muted. So if you're there, we can't hear you. You've made a comment there. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, yes, I did make a comment, but I didn't actually particularly have a question. sorry, but I was just going to, I could say on Fukushima, I think there's been a lot of effort to try and find ecological effects, but very, very little of substance has been found.
Right.
That would not surprise me. I know perhaps a little bit more about the ecological effects of the Chernobyl accident, and you know, there's pluses and minuses, and but it's certainly no sort of ecological disaster zone. In fact, it's rather the opposite in terms of fauna. Chris White had his hand up a while ago.
Sure. Chris White, did you have your hand up? Go ahead.
My comment is not on this point. Mine's to do with recognition of risk. In the competitive environment in which governments and countries and businesses find themselves, we take a sort of individualistic position, but then as a nation, we also want to try and take a cooperative position so that we can introduce policies at a world or a national level that are cooperative, even though we in our individual nations or corporations or whatever are competitive. And it's often the balance between these two forces. So in the case of countries cooperating internationally with policies like to mitigate the effects of climate change, they're also wanting to compete. And it's the whole argument between these two positions. So we can look at our own self-interest and say, well, it's best if everybody else does the things to mitigate climate change, but we don't. We become a free rider. But eventually free riders get caught out. And if you're going to be a responsible international citizen, then you have to cooperate. And it's that continuing debate between those two positions, which is the difficult part of it.
Mm.
The economic model, the prisoner's dilemma, illustrates this beautifully.
Right. I don't know that, but what you say is perfectly true. And of course, in between the national level too and the individual level, you've got things like the ANZ Bank. You know, are they simply virtue signalling, or are they indicating, you know, a willingness to push in a particularly positive direction?
Sure.
Given that we've got a little bit of time, before we go to Stephen Ames, who has the next question, I might go to Graham McLean again. He doesn't know that he's going to make this comment, and maybe he won't. But Graham, how do you feel about introducing us very briefly to Garrett Hardin and the tragedy of the commons? Because are you familiar with that?
Look, too vaguely to give you a nice, concise, clear statement. I mean, Chris could tell us about prisoner's dilemma, which I can talk about as well. You, Chris, could sound as if you could tell us about the tragedy of the commons. Well, they're related, obviously. And why don't you give us you'll do a better job.
That wasn't a Dorothy. Okay. Well, very briefly, I mean, and the reason I'm familiar with it is because I teach an introduction to climate change at Melbourne Uni. The tragedy of the commons, I think it was the name of a philosophical paper by Garrett Hardin. But the idea is the very simple one that Prisoner's Dilemma points at and that Chris has been talking about, which is that if you imagine the common as being part of the village, it belongs to everybody and it belongs to no one. And it's in everybody's self-interest to use the common to graze their animals. But it's in nobody's long-term interest to overgraze the common. So, of course, today and tomorrow, it's in everybody's individual interests to overgraze the common, to get out of the common whatever you can for your animals. But in the long term, it's not in the common interest. And of course, the global atmosphere is a common. It's a common that doesn't belong to anybody. And as long as the costs of damaging, for want of a better word, damaging the atmosphere or the planet, as long as those costs are external costs that nobody actually pays for, then it's in everybody's interests long term to look after it. But in the short term, and especially with short political cycles, it's in nobody's interests in the short term. That's just that's just a comment, really, about some of the sort of thinking about that might be interesting to some people, simply because we had enough time to make that comment. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else wants to make a comment about that, or if you want to follow up, Chris, because Chris has just finished a doctorate that had a fair bit to do with the prisoner's dilemma, didn't it, Chris? But you're muted.
It had something to do with prisoner's dilemma, because I was interested in cooperation and competition and how they interact with one another and how different ways of looking at them interact. There's, short of sort of talking at more length about prisoner's dilemma, this is probably not the place to do that. I'm not sure that I've got a lot more to say.
Sure. Thanks, Chris.
Mark Duffett has a hand up too, Chris, as well, Stephen.
Mark, did you want to follow up this? Because if you did, I'll let you speak now. But Stephen Ames is still on that list for next question or comment. Mark?
Yeah, no, sorry, I was going to return to Ian for a moment, if that was all right.
Okay, can we, if it's not on this topic, Stephen's next in line, so we'll come to you after Stephen. Go ahead, Stephen.
I want to go back to Ian's earlier part of the discussion. Is that right?
Yep.
I came in a little late, Ian, but I found myself agreeably nodding at quite a number of the slides. But I want to take up a couple of things. One thing that being part of a long-running conversation you and I had, a couple of things. One is to do with there's nothing much Australia can do that will have any effect claim. And the other is I wondered if you might provide me with some grasp of the grid issue for renewables. On the first one, I find myself disagreeing with Alan Finkel, because it seemed to me Australia could actually do two things at least. It could two things among other things, but one is to lead by example in lowering the per capita climate gases emissions, and relatedly could mobilise or help mobilise or be part of mobilising a coalition of the willing of nations like Australia, who have a small percentage of the whole overall emissions budget, but together would make estimates I've seen more than 40% of that, so that they'd have some, were that coalition to come about, a big question mark about that, but nevertheless, we're talking about possibles. It seems to me that there would be a trajectory where Australia could contribute and perhaps take the lead even, if we were seen to be exemplary in issues to do with lowering per capita emissions, which would partly, what Chris was saying then, partly be in the common good, right?
Sure.
So I just feel that the statement, there's nothing we can do, needs to be unpacked and examined much more. I'm not complaining about you're not doing this, but I just think that there are pathways here that are definitely worth pursuing. And Australia could be exemplary by reducing its per capita emissions, and well, taking an international lead, right? In that area where Chris was defining the uncertainties are for, and where people of assessing risk and so on. So that's one question. Perhaps I'd like to comment that, and then I have another one about the grid, which you might help me with.
Okay. Well, no, my comment there would be yes, that's true, but only if we're doing something that's effective and cost effective.
Oh, that's right. So you wanted to work on all levels. You don't want some some fight between the environment and the economy. You want the thing to work economically as well as other ways, but it seems to me that's a pathway that is worth voicing and pursuing.
Sure.
Right. So Alan Finkel's statement is an overstatement for me. The other one is, I take it the problem with the renewables is the fluctuations in the flow of energy and electricity, and that this is a problem for the grid as it is now. And I just wanting to be clear, but is that not a problem for electricity generated by nuclear power?
No, because with solar and wind, you've got to put your facilities, where in the best wind areas are, in particular. And those tend to be very dispersed. If you look at a map, and I can send you a map of Victoria and South Australia and so forth, where the main wind farms are, and they are dispersed. That's the first point. So you've got to build grid connections to the centre from there. To where the load is, that's the first point. The second point is that that if wind typically has got about a 30% capacity factor, therefore you're building a grid capacity and it's only being used 1/3. Whereas if you're building capacity to link to a nuclear plant, it's being used 90%. And secondly, your nuclear plants would be, in Australia, any nuclear plants would probably be on the coastline to use seawater cooling. And any transmission links you then built to them would get 3 times the utilisation of those for wind farms, and about 6 times the utilisation of those for any solar farms. That's the main point. It's interesting that in Australia, there's a great deal of potable water which is evaporated each year to cool coal-fired power plants. If you replaced those coal-fired plants by nuclear plants on the coast using direct seawater cooling, you'd save the equivalent of Melbourne's water supply, or about 2/3, of Melbourne's water supply, which in a dry continent is not insignificant. So the grid issue is one of the 4 aspects of the system costs that I referred to earlier. That would, if we went mad and built a whole lot more solar and wind capacity, would double the price of electricity here at least. Basically, every time you build a wind farm, you are locking in natural gas. And the new IEA Renewables report that came out this week sort of shows that graphically, the correlation between increased wind power, any intermittent renewables, and that's quite distinct from hydro, but intermittent renewables locks in gas effectively.
Because it needs a backup.
Yep.
Yeah. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Stephen. Back to you, Mark.
Yeah, so I had a question for Ian, and I promise I didn't premeditate this, but I just happened to have to hand some evidence that you've been at this for quite a long time.
Yes.
How have you kept it up for that long? I mean, I've sort of taken interest in these debates for probably a bit over 10 years, and I find myself getting dispirited quite a bit. How have you kept going all this time?
Yeah, well, we're talking about polarization and people talking past one another and so forth. Soon after I joined the mining industry from being a science teacher, I wrote a little book called Mining and the Environment, which was very well received because I was absolutely fascinated with the scientific principles of environmental management. I was the first head office environmental scientist in the Australian mining industry. Head office, I stress, not actually out there doing anything useful. In 1978, Rod Carnegie called me into his office and said, "This has been a great little book. I'd like you to write something about nuclear power." because people are talking past one another. You've got the Greens or whoever they were, Friends of the Earth over here, saying one thing, and you've got the industry saying another, and here's me in the middle, and I can't relate what's being said from one side to what's being said from the other side. So I think we need a book on that really puts it all together. And I'd like you to write it. And I said, that's a great idea, Rod, but I don't know the first thing about nuclear power. He said, that's all right. Ron Hubery over here, your colleague in the company, knows all about it, and but he's a bit reluctant to write. So why don't you put your heads together? Well, Ron Hubery turned out to be an evangelical Christian. So in 1978, the first edition of a book called Nuclear Electricity came out. Rod Carnegie, incidentally, said chapter 1 will be this, chapter 2 will be that, chapter 3 will cover. So in 1978, the first edition came out, and 2 years ago, the 11th edition came out, exactly 40 years later. It's under a slightly different title, but it's now at about a 95-page book in A4 format, and still covering all those basics about energy, electricity, and everything to do with nuclear power. So it's been an evolving interest, and it's having to write that book from the basis of absolute zero knowledge that hooked me in, sucked me in completely. And so then when I was able 25 years ago to move into a role which was totally focused on nuclear power, I grabbed it, and I've enjoyed it.
Thanks, Ian.
Chris White.
Chris White.
Unmute. Unmute, Chris.
We can't hear you, Chris. There we can now.
Could I ask Ian to comment on the role of battery technology in making renewables more usable? Because when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining, the electricity can be stored.
Yes, but the last statement isn't really correct at the scale required. Battery technology, such as the big battery in South Australia, which started off as 130 megawatts and now I think gone to something like 200 megawatts, is very useful in making wind more usable. But its main role is in ancillary services, particularly frequency control. It's not only about a third of its capacity at the most is used for actual energy storage. And that's the case with most big batteries that are grid connected in relation to intermittent renewable sources. In terms of actually storing power, storing energy, storing electricity that can be fed back when the sun goes down or the wind goes down, wind switches off, very little use and very expensive. It's the cost that's the real issue at that sort of scale. But I can point you to we've got a paper on our website, World Nuclear Association website, on energy storage, and that has got a fair bit of detail about batteries and so on. But the point is, 95% of the energy storage or electricity storage in the world is pumped storage. And Australia, of course, has a very expensive scheme planned for the Snowy Mountain. There is some dispute as to whether that's cost effective or not. I've not got sufficiently into it to have a view on the matter. But basically we don't have much scope for pumps. I mean, there's obviously some pump storage already in the system. This would be a significant addition.
So just to clarify, pump storage being when you've got excess electricity, you can pump water uphill. So it's up the top of the hill, and when you need it, you let it down and it makes electricity for you.
It makes 70% of the amount of electricity you put in to get it up the hill.
Yep.
So if you've got heaps and heaps of renewable generation, yes, you know, there is some sense in that.
You have to have hills.
Yeah, you have to have hills and you have to have water.
Let me ask a provocative question. It's not mine. It comes from possibly the youngest person who's with us this evening, who might be one of my sons, but I won't dob him in too much. He asks a question like this. Could it be that the caution about climate change science leads to the conclusion that, and the idea that responding is not urgent? Couldn't this be a convenient excuse for individualistic Christians who are materialistic to keep depleting the world of its resources at the expense of the poor?
Yes, it could be. But in what way are we depleting the world of its resources at the expense of the poor? I would want to see a lot more. I'd like to have that aspect fleshed out so that I knew what I was answering. I mean, that's the sort of thing that is commonly said from certain quarters. I don't think it's demonstrable, and I've written a book to suggest that it's in fact insupportable. And you may know of it. The second edition, 2015, on the web, sorry, what is it? Kindle.
Responsible Dominion?
Yes.
We can leave everybody to Google Responsible Dominion and buy their copy. Are there any other questions or comments? I believe we're getting close to time. Yes. Going once.
Yes.
Yes, Rex, go ahead.
Yes. An anecdote for you. About in the 70s, I paid a visit to southern India to stay with a pastor. I noticed there, it was in the dry season, I noticed the women of the village would pick up cow poo and slap it on the side of the houses and it would dry out. In the evening, they would burn this to cook the food. And the air quality is very, very poor. I'd put a fresh shirt on in the morning. It'd be by 10 in the morning, it'd be black around the collar and the cuffs. I think these people are breathing this stuff year in, year out. They've done it for centuries, really. The wet season, of course, it's a different story. To India wanting to produce more electricity, and I think the poor would benefit enormously to have a clean source. So that's all I've got to say.
Yes, well, India is doing a lot in terms of both establishing a national grid, which it has only had little bits of, and you know, electrification of India is a huge priority for them, which of course has relevance to our view of the Mr. Adani's Carmichael mine in Queensland, which sends the left into paroxysms. That you know, that's part of the issue that I finished up commenting on with regard to climate change. I think we have a moral obligation to supply coal to India to aid that electrification. And I think that the health effects of doing that are arguably much greater than any negative health effects of the extra CO2 emissions. But who would know? How would you actually enumerate that?
Mark, I think you've got a final comment to make. Go ahead.
Yeah, so just what I voiced in the chat, that I would turn it around, that a Christian concern about putting all our blinkers on for focus on climate action and going wildly towards particular paths that are unproven and may not work out there's a very high risk of substantially increasing poverty. So Christian concern for the poor means we need to be really careful about getting our climate action and climate response right. And it's not just about climate mitigation, that the adaptation has to be considered as well.
Yep.
And the scope for that.
Yep.
Okay. Well, let me say thank you very much, Ian. It's been a very stimulating evening. Thank you all for participating. Allow me to pray for us as we finish. Lord God, thank you for our time tonight. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about topics that really do matter. They matter because they have implications for people all across the globe. They matter because they have implications for the pursuit of truth. They matter because they have implications for the good of our society. We pray that you'll help us all to think seriously about these issues, take these issues seriously, and work out what it means to be a Christian in a society and culture that is wrestling with these issues and that tends to be dominated by polarized views. Help us to be leaven in the lump, or whatever that means in the place that we find ourselves. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.